You've read his words 1,000 times, printed in red letters, quoted in sermons, stitched onto pillows, tattooed on forearms. But here's something that might stop you cold. Jesus of Nazareth never wrote a single word of it down. Not one sentence, not one letter, not one scrap of parchment with his own handwriting on it has ever been found, because none was ever made. Doesn't that feel strange? Think about it. Every other founder of a major world religion left something behind in their own hand, or at least dictated in a way that was recorded immediately. Muhammad's recitations were compiled into the Quran within decades. Confucius's students wrote down his sayings almost as he spoke them. But Jesus, the man at the center of the largest religion on earth, walked away from his ministry, leaving behind nothing but memory. So why? Was it an oversight? Was it neglect? Or was it something far more deliberate? To understand this, you have to understand what writing actually meant in first-century Galilee. Literacy rates in the region are estimated by historians like Catherine Hezer, a scholar of ancient Jewish literacy at SOAS University of London, to have been somewhere between 3 and 10%. Reading and writing were not everyday skills. They belonged to scribes, priests, and the wealthy. A carpenter's son from Nazareth, a town so small it isn't even mentioned in the Old Testament or in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, would have had little reason or opportunity to become a trained writer. But that's only part of the answer, because Jesus clearly could read. Luke's gospel describes him standing in the synagogue at Nazareth, unrolling the scroll of Isaiah and reading from it aloud. So reading, at least, wasn't beyond him. Writing, though, was a different skill entirely in the ancient world. It required years of specific training with a stylus or reed pen, often taught separately from reading itself. Most people who could read some Hebrew or Aramaic never learned to write fluently in it. Still, that doesn't fully explain it either. Because Jesus wasn't merely illiterate by circumstance, he was operating inside a culture that already had a name for what he was doing instead. He was a rabbi. And rabbis in first-century Judaism didn't primarily transmit their teaching through writing. They transmitted it through oral tradition, through memorization, through repetition drilled into disciples who were expected to carry the words forward by heart. This was not a lesser method. It was in many ways considered superior. Ancient Jewish culture had an enormous respect for memory. The Mishnah, compiled generations later, preserved centuries of rabbinic teaching that had been passed down orally long before it was ever written. Students of a rabbi were trained specifically to become walking repositories of his words. A good disciple, as the ancient rabbinic saying goes, was like a well-plastered cistern that doesn't lose a single drop. Does that change how you picture the disciples? Not as passive listeners, but as trained memorizers, shaped by a culture where the highest form of devotion to a teacher was to become a living copy of his teaching. There's a phrase scholars use for this: oral Torah culture. In this world, writing something down could almost cheapen it. A written text sits static on a page, but a teaching carried in the hearts and mouths of disciples travels, adapts to the audience in front of it, and stays alive in a way ink on parchment cannot. Jesus taught almost entirely in short, rhythmic, memorable units, parables, proverbs, and repeated phrases, precisely the kind of material built for oral transmission. Notice how often his sayings rhyme in structure even in translation. The first shall be last. Whoever finds his life will lose it. This isn't accidental, it's the architecture of something meant to be remembered, not read. There's also a bigger reason, one that reaches into who Jesus claimed to be. In Jewish tradition, the ultimate act of writing belonged to God alone. God wrote the 10 Commandments with his own finger onto stone at Sinai, according to Exodus. Prophets received the word of the Lord and spoke it, but they did not typically write the definitive text of Scripture themselves in the way we might imagine an author. Their words were often recorded later by scribes and successors. Jesus, stepping into that same pattern, speaking with authority and letting others carry the word forward, echoes exactly how divine revelation had always worked in Israel's history. He wasn't producing a book. He was, according to the Gospel of John, presenting himself as the Word itself, Logos, made flesh. Why would the Word need to write words? There is exactly one moment in the Gospels where Jesus is described physically writing something, and it's worth pausing on. In John chapter 8, when religious leaders bring a woman caught in adultery before him, Jesus bends down and writes on the ground with his finger. The text never tells us what he wrote. Scholars have debated it for centuries. Some suggest he was listing the sins of her accusers. Others connect it to Jeremiah chapter 17, where the prophet says, "Those who turn away from the Lord will be written in the dust." Whatever it was, it vanished within moments, erased by wind or a passing foot. It was never meant to last. Even in the one instance we see him write, the words disappear. So what happened to his teachings instead? They lived inside people. For roughly 3 decades after his death, this is genuinely how the story of Jesus survived, entirely through spoken transmission, preached, retold, and passed hand to hand through communities before a single gospel was written. Paul's earliest letters, written in the 50s, quote what appear to be pre-existing oral formulas and hymns already circulating among believers, meaning organized, memorized traditions about Jesus existed before Paul ever picked up a pen. The Gospels themselves, most scholars date Mark to somewhere around the year 70, decades after the crucifixion, were written down only once the eyewitness generation began to pass away and the community needed a permanent record for the future. Does it unsettle you slightly that the foundation of Christian faith rested for so long on memory before it rested on paper? It shouldn't, not entirely. Ancient memory culture was disciplined in ways modern readers often underestimate. Formal rabbinic students could reportedly recite entire bodies of teaching verbatim. The idea that oral transmission was sloppy or unreliable says more about our modern dependence on writing than it does about the actual capabilities of first-century memory-trained communities, and there's something almost intentional in the whole shape of it. A teacher who never wrote his message down forces that message to become relational rather than merely textual. You cannot memorize something you don't live inside. You cannot faithfully carry forward a teaching to another person without embodying some part of it yourself. Writing distances a message from its source. Oral tradition binds a message to the community that carries it. Perhaps that's the deeper theology hiding inside this small historical fact. The words of Jesus were never meant to sit quietly on a shelf. They were meant to move through people, generation to generation, changing the one who carried them just as much as the one who first heard them. You've read his words 1,000 times, printed in red letters, quoted in sermons, stitched onto pillows, tattooed on forearms. But now you know the truth behind the page. Every one of those words survived not because Jesus wrote them down, but because someone chose to remember.